Excellent. So you might wonder why a European historian is going to talk to you today briefly about Prohibition in Vermillion. And the answer is that in the spring of 2018, I led a group of USD honors students, most of whom were not history majors, in producing a podcast on that topic, which we titled Of Drunkards and Scofflaws. And that title was thought up by Isaac Otterman, who is now a playwright. And the whole podcast is available on USD's website, on the RED research site through the library. The podcast covered topics such as the bootlegger Milton Schooley, the Beersford Superstill, the island or asymptote, attitudes towards prohibition seen at the University of South Dakota, and the trial of Ozzie Kirby. We uncovered some fun tidbits, including the fact that the motto of the Davis Pharmacy used to be, "We either have it, we'll get it, or it isn't made." I just put up a few dates here, and I'm not going to cover this whole thing because this isn't a lecture. The Prohibition in South Dakota, as you can see, began earlier in 1917 and lasted longer than the period of national prohibition. So when South Dakota voted its constitution, it voted in prohibition in 1889. It voted it out in 1896. That voting prohibition out did not apply to Vermillion because there was a law that put a 3-mile dry radius around the university. So Vermillion remained dry even though the rest of the state went wet in 1896. There were multiple campaigns, and then it was voted in again. Prohibition was voted in again in 1917. The type of prohibition that South Dakota voted in was called bone dry because it applied to everything. Legally, the only two places in Vermillion that had alcohol were the university, which could use it for experiments, and Davis Pharmacy. Everything else, you couldn't have medicinal wine at home. It was harsher than the national prohibition that was passed in 1919, the Volstead Act, and then went into effect in January 1920. National prohibition was repealed in 1933, but state prohibition was not repealed until almost a year later. So prohibition in South Dakota lasted longer and was legally harsher than it was elsewhere in the nation. The historian Herb Schell said that from 1885 until 1917, Vermillion was essentially a dry town with vigorous enforcement. The university bylaw was dry, and there was this 3-mile radius around the university in which no alcohol could be sold. The first 2 saloons in Vermillion were built in 1874, 15 years after Vermillion was founded. And Vermillion's prohibition experience in some ways parallels the broader national experience in areas of the United States where prohibition had significant public support. So if you're going to compare South Dakota and Vermillion's prohibition experiences, you don't want to look at New York City. You want to look at Kansas. You want to look at parts of the Deep South. You want to look at places that had their own state prohibition in effect alongside national prohibition. Temperance and abstinence from alcohol were, at least officially and publicly, dominant in the 19-teens leading up to national prohibition. But that attitude gradually erodes during the period of national prohibition itself. And that happens in South Dakota, it happens at the university, and it happens nationally. So that's one way in which Vermillion's experience, South Dakota's experience, parallels what happens nationally. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Why that erosion happens is not completely clear. It's not due to any one thing. Certainly one of the reasons that it happens, right? You're a charitable organization. You got to constantly do things to sustain your energy. The temperance advocates win in 1920, and then what do? Alcohol is illegal. So what now, right? Is that a lot of those temperance organizations, they didn't go away, but they had won, so their energy shifted to doing other things, and they lost ground during the later 1920s. We can see these changes in the way alcohol is discussed at the University of South Dakota, from strong temperance and prohibition leading towards the gradual return of the demon liquor. Prior to the enactment of prohibition, USD was vigorously temperate. President Robert Slagle, shown here, threatened to expel any member of the student body in 1917 who was caught drinking. President Slagle looks to me like someone, if he threatened you, you stayed threatened. So I think he's also trying to look like Teddy Roosevelt, but that could just be me. Somewhat ironically, of course, President Slagle also started Dakota Days in 1914. So, and he died in 1929, so he had no idea what it would become. The YMCA and the YWCA, the Young Men's Christian Association and the Young Women's Christian Association, very active pro-temperance organizations, were two of the biggest and most active groups on campus prior to World War I in 1917. Of course, the fact that President Slagle had to threaten people indicates that there were people on campus who were partaking. He probably didn't threaten students with expulsion for no reason. We can see a lot of this in the university archives and in the records like the volant. The volants from this period are not digitized, so this is an earlier edition I just brought in as an example. But this is one of the articles that we used in the podcast. It's the volant from the 16th of May, 1916. And you can see that they're raising, they're going to get people for a dry state campaign to campaign once the prohibition is back on the ballot, right? And this is for state prohibition. And they're trying to organize people from the Anti-Saloon League. The Anti-Saloon League, you might have seen its founding date in the earlier slide. Most famous member is Carrie Nation. She did speak here in Vermillion at what became later on a fraternity, which is an odd place to, but you know, lots of buildings have changed hands or changed locations. And by 1917, the USD branch of the Young Men's Christian Association had prohibition teams which spoke and organized in Clay and Union counties. They included, I'm quoting the description here, 5 university men and a dry quartet. The USD orchestra played for some of their events, so this was something that was part of and affiliated with the university. At one of the events in 1917, the USD orchestra played at a Vermillion church. The volant does not specify which one, but we can guess that it's the predecessor to Trinity Lutheran, because the presiding officer, the county president for the Prohibition movement in Clay County, was the Reverend Olaf Line, who was the leader of what is now the Elka Lutheran Church, which is not where it is now, changed location in the 1960s, I think. So this was a Vermillion organization, right? It's the university, but it's a local church leader working around the county for temperance. By the early 1930s, even as USD remains a dry campus, which of course it still does, you can see references to alcohol consumption on campus sneaking in. Perhaps unsurprisingly, many of these references come in association with fraternity and sorority life. If you have never heard of it before, this is The Wet Hen, which was a satirical publication published by journalism students, all of whom belonged to one of the sororities on campus. So it was a female-led, it did have male staff members, but it was staffed by one of the sororities. I forgot to write down in my notes which one. And they gradually, this satire gradually included more and more examples of either appreciation for alcohol or satirical descriptions of incidents involving alcohol on campus. So, for example, The Wet Hen of 1932 has a bit of verse that ends, it's a long poem, I won't read you the whole thing, but that ends with, "An enemy I know to all is wicked, wicked alcohol. The Bible, though, commandeth me to learn to love mine enemy." Right? That's not the stuff that you find in the Volant or the Coyote Yearbook in 1917. Right? You don't find that stuff. The Coyote Yearbooks were much bigger and much more involved than they are. I don't even know if they even still exist now, but then they became. The 1929 Coyote Yearbook has a whole satirical article called the Coyote Howl column on professors brewing alcohol. Right? So again, this is presumably referring to the fact that the chemistry faculty were allowed to make alcohol for chemistry experiments, and that was one of the few places that alcohol existed. And this article ends with, "Alcoholically speaking, from a boozological standpoint, the idea of keeping this stuff locked up is wrong. No student would ever think of taking any of this liquor, but the thing that hurts about the whole affair is that the faculty don't trust us." Right? Another example that back in the 1920s and 1930s, university publications, satirical publications, loved running columns, lost and found columns, fake advertisements, things like that. One of them was from 1929, "Found an empty bottle in the back of the Beta House. Owner may have seen by identifying the smell and paying for this ad." That is next to an advertisement that I just have always enjoyed that I'm going to inflict on you because I'm up here at the front of the room. "Lost, strayed, or stolen, a man. When last seen wearing a grin and flopping galoshes, finder please hold until I get there, Dorothy Thompson." And it was common for people to put their friends in these satirical columns. So almost all of you can obviously look up the rosters and you can find out who these people were. So I have no idea what Dorothy Thompson did to offend the people from the Coyote Yearbook or to be their friends. This is another example that we found in the archives is this fake apology card, as it says at the top, "For inebriated social lions, regrets exceedingly his conduct on your check dance or house party. Please accept his humble apologies for breaches of etiquette checked in the adjoining column." And the things include passing out, destruction of furniture, commenting on lousy party, starting crap game, kissing female guest, indiscreet petting, nausea, belching, target spitting, singing sweet Adeline, spiking punch, undressing in front room, refusing to go home, spanking chaperone, or complete loss of equilibrium. So the fact that the Wet Hen is joking about this, that there are these parties where you would need a card to show up to apologize for how hammered you were at it during Prohibition on a dry campus, presumably indicates to us that attitudes have changed since the marching of the 1917 and 1918 parades by the Young Women's Christian Association. There is still support for Prohibition, by the way, which you can find some other examples of. I just want to cover a few things briefly here to give us 5 minutes, so I'll just, for a few questions, so I'll just mention a few of the other highlights. The Super Still, the Chicago mob, Al Capone's outfit, set up a major still on a farm 10 miles southwest of Beersford and 20 miles north of Vermillion in 1934. This is after Prohibition has ended, but at this point, of course, the gangsters are making so much money from alcohol that they were keeping to do it. On the farm of a man named Thurl Swanson. The estimated construction cost of this still was $18,000 in 1934 money, which is over $400,000 today. It could produce 1,000 gallons of liquor a day. It made one run of liquor, made over $25,000, and it was raided on the 29th of September 1934. The people arrested in the raid included the Clay County Sheriff, William Russell, and his brother and Deputy George. They spent a night in jail, paid a fine, and resumed their jobs on the 31st of September. The island, also called Asymptote or Tote, was an island in the river created by the 1881 flood. It was conveniently located in between the jurisdictions of Nebraska and South Dakota, and so it was available for bootleggers and for illegal parties by both Nebraskans and South Dakotans who would travel north or south to sail out to the island. It was ownership of the island was in dispute, which led to the murder of Peter Olson. On the 25th of October, 1940, a man named Ozzie Kirby walked into the law offices of Payne and Olson in Vermillion and shot Peter Olson in the head. Olson's partner, Jason Payne, and another lawyer wrestled Kirby down, and the police chief, Harry Fowler, was able to apprehend Kirby, who was then tried. Kirby shot Olson because he was convinced that Kirby and Olson were defrauding him of his ownership of the island. Kirby was tried and found guilty of first-degree manslaughter. He used an insanity defense, apparently one of the early examples of that in South Dakota, served 7 years of his 10-year sentence. So that was actually after Prohibition was over, obviously, but a repercussion of the island. Finally, I'll just mention briefly what we thought were Vermillion's most notorious bootleggers, Milton and Lafford Schooley. I don't have pictures of them. They were in trouble with the law repeatedly. They were brothers and farmers. They were caught for the first time smuggling liquor in 1923. They had it hidden in a granary in Wakanda and would bring it down to Vermillion to sell. They had repeated run-ins and arrests between 1923 and 1925. Milton Schooley was arrested twice in early 1925. The first of these arrests, the Dakota Republican newspaper on the 15th of January 1925, noted that Milton's wife, Alma, during his arrest at his home, was found to be hiding a jug of moonshine under her skirts. The Scholeys had 9 children. Because of that, the law took mercy on Milton. Unfortunately, he chose to either accidentally or on purpose, is not clear, to ingest an insecticide while in the penitentiary and died on the 5th of July, 1925. What happened to Alma and their children is not recorded. So those are a few of the highlights of Vermillion's Prohibition experience. I think we have exactly 5 minutes for questions before 1 o'clock. Dr. Shorn.
Were there any speakeasies in Vermillion that you were able to uncover?
Not that we were able to uncover. Nope. Not that we were able to uncover. Yes, Chuck.
What was the major type of alcohol? Was it always one type?
It wasn't always one type. It was mostly grain alcohol whiskey. So because there was a lot of corn and wheat, that was the easiest thing for people. That was the easiest thing for people to make. It was relatively easy for farmers if you could get a still, to set up a still and distill alcohol, because the Prohibition officers were focused on the towns. There was a lot of, as you know, what's now Highway 29, there was a lot of policing of traffic between Sioux Falls and Vermillion, but there were not Prohibition agents going out knocking on people's farms to see what people were doing. So it was mostly liquors that you could make out of whatever you were growing on the farm. Yes.
How about, you had mentioned Davis Pharmacy and the university. How about like the Catholic Church? I know when I went to Napa wine country,
Yeah.
they said that was kind of what kept some places or some of the vineyards going, is that they could actually supply the Catholic Church with wine.
The Catholic Church had a dispensation, and at least for some of the time, the liquor was kept locked up. Like you weren't able to keep it in the church, like at the Concordia Lutheran, which I go to. It's just in the side of it's off to the side. But it was kept locked up somewhere else. So I'm not sure how eventually that worked out. here, but they had a dispensation. Davis Pharmacy could write prescriptions for medicinal liquor. They used to have, one of the people we interviewed, Matt Lavin, for this podcast, and some of the stuff that Davis Pharmacy used to have from the Prohibition era weren't kept. So they used to have more stuff than they had, but they had prescription pads from the Prohibition era where they could write prescriptions for medicinal alcohol. So you wanted to be friends with the Lavins. But they were pretty carefully regulated. Art, and then Tim.
I'll relate a story much later than Prohibition, but about 1980, when I was state's attorney, we raided one of the fraternity houses that was doing an illegal party and seized their supply of liquor. Monday morning, I got a call from the Attorney General. The entire fraternity had driven to Pier and wanted to deliver an ultimatum that unless we returned their alcohol to them and dropped the charges, they were going to organize a boycott so that no students would drink alcohol in Vermillion during the following year. We didn't drop the charges and we didn't notice any particular in alcohol consumption.
That makes sense to me. All right.
Given that Mr. Morrison is from Wakanda, I would suggest that a fine is in order for Wakanda attempting to corrupt the morals.
Well, Tim, do we really want the Wakanda Mafia?
Oh, good point, yeah.
I was just curious if there was any connection between famous bootleggers like fourth cousins twice removed to the Quayle family.
As far as I know, the Piles were entirely respectable. So maybe not entirely. Patrick.
Did you see like any, like, because Wakanda, I mean, there's a lot of Irish folks up there, and the old family history
Yeah.
is that, like, you know, they just, stick it in a pile of
Yeah.
or whatever. Like, did you find, like, so, but I suppose there's probably not a lot of record because it's not like the revenue guys were going out to the farms to look for stills, right? Is that kind of the...
Right. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that it's particularly interesting to me about this project, right, is that a university has multiple levels of life, right? It's got faculty and staff who are here for a long time. There's the official story of the institution. Then there's the life of the people who make the institution work, who are here for a long time. And then there are the students. And the hardest thing to capture is the students, because they're here for 4 years and often don't leave records, and they're more ephemeral, right? The students in the 19-teens, the 1920s, and the 1930s were interested in leaving records of what they had done. But they were not interested in leaving records about what they had done that they didn't want people to know about. And so part of what's interesting about the shift, right, is that the Volant and the Coyote yearbooks, all of those were vetted by faculty or staff or by other people. So the idea that the Volant reporters are going out in 1917 and they're reporting on temperance rallies and they're helping organize speakers and they're reprinting what President Slagle says, and the Volant is front and center, like we are a dry campus and this is what we are doing, towards the end where they're slipping in little jokes about how people at the fraternities are getting bombed, even though it's still illegal, right? That shift happens. And why exactly that shift happens, I don't know, because there's not the record. There are people there's a small minority of, or a minority of people who are this whole time vigorously hardline temperance. There is a smaller number of people who are drunks and want alcohol, and there are a lot of people in between. During the vote that repeals Prohibition in South Dakota, Clay County actually votes to keep Prohibition. We have the voting records, right? Clay County, more people in Clay County vote to keep South Dakota dry, despite the fact that national Prohibition has ended. But other parts of South Dakota, rural South Dakota, votes overwhelmingly to end the state prohibition. So it doesn't seem like it now, but Vermillion in the 20s and the 30s is a very dry town. I mean, that's not true now, but it seems to be true. But what we don't have are records or accounts. There are some oral histories that mention it, or records or accounts from people who are breaking the law. except sort of anecdotally. So that's harder to trace. So,
I think I'd like to see the apology cards come back for Dakota Days and DP between.
yeah. I think the apology card is a great idea. I would love to see it resurrected, so, yeah. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Dr.
Well, thank you.
All right, so as we conclude, don't forget to take another look at those little sheets there, and let me know if you're interested in being involved in any of our committees, all right? Hospitality Committee, D-Days Parade Committee,